Luke Fitzgerald on Warren Gatland. So you experienced Gatland in '09, and you made a very interesting point. We were just chatting off air. He simplifies complicated pictures and gives pretty simple message. So, for instance, in '09 in that tour, a big focus was ball and play time.
Yeah, and I think the focus was to try and keep the ball in play, to move the South African pack that Matt referenced earlier on around. They're big guys, they generally have good kickers. So if they get to go from point to point on the pitch, from line out to scrum, that probably plays to their advantages. And I think what he would feel like is if you can move those big guys around, if you can keep the ball in play, opportunities will present themselves, and it probably nullifies the impact that those big guys can have in the tight exchanges. So it'll be interesting to see if that's the tact he decides to employ this time. I think they might try and play a little bit more expansive, but at some point you are going to have to be physical. So he will have to play a little bit of warm ball in there somewhere. Whether or not he marries in a Gregor Townsend kind of mindset, maybe a bit more of a flamboyant maybe style, it will be interesting to see. But I do think that fundamental ball and play time, I think they'll have something and an easy enough target for them to hit this time around, because it does add value, and I think it will be something that you could wear the South African guys down, even despite the game being on the high veld.
Yeah, the Gregor Townsend inclusion is very interesting, Matt. So I presume you're not bringing Gregor Townsend there for him to do nothing. That would indicate maybe a more expansive plan on the Lions' behalf, no?
It's an interesting one, Joe. On the face of it, you would. 101 for the Lions is they've got to win their scrum ball, because if we go back to Luke's tour in the first test, the Lions scrum got destroyed. We go to the World Cup, the English scrum got destroyed. So he's going to focus on set play attack and set play defence. How you then take apart South Africa is exceptionally difficult, because they play rush defence. But what they may come up with is that rush defence leaves space in behind and space at the end of the line. So Townsend is also very good at crossfield kicks, getting players to be in position to exploit that space behind and at the end of the line, and also the short side, which I think Greg was particularly good at. And I think the South Africans are very, very vulnerable on the short side. New Zealand over the years have shown that. But I think the advantage that the Lions have, they know exactly what South Africa are going to do. Giant pack, scrummage and line out, we'll rush defence, and we'll have a brilliant kicking game and goal kicker.
Yes.
And not much else. And that's won them 3 World Cups. So, and it's easy for me to say, but that's still a great challenge to nullify, because they're brilliant at it.
Yeah, Shane, I think back to the World Cup semi-final, and it was Gatland's Wales against South Africa, and it was a fairly turgid, conservative affair. Do you suspect Gatland maybe looked at that and thought, I need something a bit different here?
Well, I hope so. I think if you were being uncharitable, you would say it's not that Gatland simplifies a complex game plan. He just has a simple game plan. And to some degree, that might be useful for a Lions tour. But I think we do need a little bit subtly. And I'm actually quite optimistic about Gatland and this coaching team, because, as I said, he is a coach who's proven that he's learned from his experience, and he's evolved over time as well. And there's definitely a big lesson to be learned from what went on in that tour last time out against New Zealand, and how a little bit more subtlety, more sophistication was necessary to compete against them. Now, I agree with Matt, and it was interesting to hear Gatland speak in that interview. He spoke about physicality, and yes, that is going to be the watchword throughout this whole tour. If you can't compete physically with South Africa at the tackle, in the carry, at scrum time, you can forget about it. But it's not just enough to match them in that. With that rush defence that they implement, you have to think a little bit more about how you're attacking, whether that be over the top with kicks, or can you move wide through the centres. And now I think that's the crucial element of where of tactical awareness for the Lions team. It's what is going to go on in the centres. I think we need at least one centre that can distribute out wide and get around that rush defence, and also a centre that has a kicking game. And that's why I would look, even with Farrell's sort of disappointing form over the last number of months in an English jersey, I think that we need a 12 that can have that passing, kicking game. Now, that doesn't rule out Henshaw, and I think he's an option at 13, but I do think that we need that 2 first receivers at 10 and 12, and that is the way to beat the South African team.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting point, because I know, Luke Fitzgerald, you are not a fan of Farrell at 12.
No, I think it's a huge mistake. I think England suffered that, and aside from the scrum in the final against South Africa, they fell into that trap of playing Farrell against a really physical side in South Africa. That works against New Zealand. We saw that in the semi-final. We saw it in the last tour where you had 2 10s playing 10 and 12. Doesn't work against South Africa, in my opinion. I think it'd be a big mistake. They need the physicality in there. I think Robbie Henshaw, as I mentioned earlier on, has a part to play in that. He has the physicality, but he has a ball-playing side to him too. And he does have a decent kicking game, even though I doubt he'll employ it as much against South Africa. I think he's the key guy in there. And I'd like to see him, employ that little bit of handling and that little bit of, I think he has a subtle part to his game that we don't see often enough, probably in an Irish jersey. I think he's the guy that fills that gap for me. I can see why you might pick Farrell there, but I think it'd be a big mistake.
Okay. The joys of different opinion. Matt, do you want to settle that one for us? You can have casting vote.
Look, I'm not sitting on the fence here, but I seriously believe it's going to depend who turns up on the tour and plays well, because it's exactly what Shane Horgan said, that on the last tour, he ended up with Farrell and Sexton. He didn't want that, but that's the way it turned out. Now, I'd probably go a little bit along Luke's line that I wouldn't, against South Africa, I wouldn't have Farrell at 12.
Okay.
If you think when New Zealand were very good there, they had Ma Nonu and against South Africa, and they didn't like it. The South Africans didn't like that, and they got back at their 10s who mightn't be the greatest defenders. So I would sit there. But I think we're going to see an evolution of this team over the first few games.
Yes.
And we'll know a lot more. Right now, it's just us old guys talking about it, but once we see the games, we see the tactics, I think that'll come out a lot more.